Good morning and happy Wednesday. Today we are looking at paying taxes to Caesar in Mark chapter 12, verses 13 through 17. We'll read through it a couple of times and then we'll look at what it shows us about people, what it shows us about God, and how to respond to it, or some possible ways to respond to what we see here. And they sent to him some of the Pharisees and some of the Herodians to trap him in his talk. And they came and said to him, Teacher, we know that you are true and do not care about anyone's opinion, for you are not swayed by appearances, but truly teach the way of God. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay them or should we not? But, knowing their hypocrisy, he said to them, Why put me to the test? Bring me a denarius and let me look at it. And they brought one. And he said to them, Whose likeness and inscription is this? They said to him, Caesar's. Jesus said to them, Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And they marveled at him. So real briefly, just recapping the story. Before this, the chief priests, elders, and scribes had come to Jesus, asked him by what authority he was teaching and especially clearing the temple of the money changers and those selling animals. And he had replied, well, I'll tell you if you tell me by what authority John the Baptist was baptizing. Was his baptism from heaven or from man? And they wouldn't reply. They said, we don't know. So we told them a parable that essentially pinned them down as the unrighteous tenants who are misusing the vineyard that they have been allowed to have tenancy in. They're not leading Israel right, essentially. And he foretold essentially of their destruction. So now they have gone away and they're sending others to try and trap Jesus by asking him this question that in essence has no right answer. Because if Jesus says, yes, it's right to pay taxes to Caesar, then they'll say, well, you're a traitor against Israel because you're saying we should support this occupying enemy because Rome is currently ruling over Israel. But if he says, no, you shouldn't pay taxes to Caesar, aha, you're a traitor against Caesar. So there's no right answer in essence, but Jesus sees through their hypocrisy, sees that this is a question to trap him, and he gives a brilliant answer that both answers the question and then also kind of puts it back on them to some extent. So there's a study tool that's really taken from Discovery Bible Study, where you kind of read through a passage a couple of times, then you retell it from memory, then you ask 3 questions, kind of 4 questions. What does this tell us about God? What does this tell us about people, including ourselves? What might it look like to respond to this passage in obedience? And then specifically, how will I, prayerfully, what will I do in response to this? So making it very personal. So we're going to go through 3 of those questions today, and then the 4th, how will I respond? May the Lord give you wisdom if there's something that he wants you to respond to this passage in. And I'm going to do it a little bit out of order because we see what's going on with people before really we see so much of what's going on with Jesus. So we're going to start with, what does it show us about people? First, they don't like to lose. So the chief priests, elders, and scribes had already been kind of rebuffed in their, or rebutted in their conversation with him. Jesus had already really condemned them, and they had left and went away, but they're not giving up. They're not going to lose, so they're sending others to trap him. And so we see that in verse 13. Then in verse 14, we see them using deceit and flattery in pursuit of their will. So people will use deceit, um, they'll use flattery, even if they might think that what they're doing is good and right. They're going about it like that they're trying to preserve the temple, um, but they're going about it in a deceitful and flattering way. We also see that people can be hypocrites, expressing outward concerns or questions different from their actual main concern. So their main issue isn't about Caesar and paying taxes at this point. It's about Jesus. They don't believe Jesus has the authority to be doing what he's doing, and that was expressed by this group earlier. And second, more deeply, they're concerned about their system being taken away, and we see this not in this passage, but over in the Gospel of John. After Jesus raised Lazarus, they called together the council, of which the chief priests and the elders and the scribes were no doubt part, as well as the Pharisees. And they said, what are we doing if we keep allowing him to do these marvelous works? Everybody's going to believe him, and then the Romans are going to come and take away our place in our nation. So they I guess believed that Jesus was a messianic pretender and that he was going to get enough gathering that the Romans were going to see him as a significant enough threat that they would just come in and kind of destroy the temple and destroy the nation, or at least take away any authority that they had, because they still had some authority. And so that's their underlying concern, but they're not actually going to pursue addressing that concern directly. They're just trying to stop him in other ways. So hypocrisy. People can be hypocrites, and more on that in a minute. People can use insincere questions. We see them using this insincere question as a smokescreen to trap or stump, and this happens, I see regularly in apologetics and in evangelism. And it can happen on both sides. The apologist or evangelist can use insincere questions to try and trap the person who's being evangelized, or the evangelist people who don't like Christianity can try and use trapping questions to trap the evangelist into basically being seen as an idiot or not a good person. But on the other side, we also see by this question that they bring that we face legitimate dilemmas. And we can desire faithfulness in those dilemmas. So in this case, we really have dilemmas like this, where there's this concern of, if I pay taxes to Caesar, am I faithful in following God? There's sincere dilemmas where we, as those who are following God, can feel like, okay, can I obey or can I submit to man here and not disobey God? So there are sincere dilemmas. And we see, according to Jesus' response, that we are to render proper submission to both God and the rulers of the land, if you will, Caesar in this case. And where it wouldn't conflict with obedience to God, we render submission to Caesar. And more on that in a minute, but there's a great passage in Romans 13 on that. So then what does this show us about Jesus, who is God? He sees right through the attempts to trap him. In verse 15, he sees their hypocrisy, knowing their hypocrisy. So whether he could see right through to their heart disposition, sometimes we know he can read the minds of the people who are there. He knows their thoughts. But whether it's that, or in this case, it's just their flattery was so evident that he knows that this is a question to trap him. In any event, he sees right through it. And he has such wisdom, as I said earlier, he's able to both answer the question without falling victim to the trap. So he's able to answer the question, yes, you pay taxes to Caesar, in essence, but without falling victim to the trap, and to put the question back on them, in a sense, meaning, are they rendering to God what is God's? God, what is God's? Well, our whole self. We're to love him with all our heart, all our soul, and all our might. And are they rendering to God what is God's? To God what is God's, especially with their hypocrisy and trying to trap the Son of God with flattery? So he has such a wisdom to put this question really back on them, and put them in a bind, put the burden back on them. Are you rendering to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's? So last question, what might it look like to respond to this passage? I see a few things. First, beware of flattery, hypocrisy, and insincere questions. So people might try to flatter us, to lure us into something, or ask insincere questions. But then there's also the real concern of our own hearts. Are we going to use flattery to try and get what we want? Will we use hypocrisy? Will we try to make ourselves look like somebody that perhaps we're not, in order to have people think of us in a particular way? We can all fall victim to that. So while we look at this and rightly say this is wrong, we have to be careful about our own hearts and how we fall victim to hypocrisy. There's a great definition of flattery that a particular Bible teacher online, Finney Carivola, shared one time, and that is, flattery is saying something to somebody's face that you wouldn't say behind their back. Saying something to somebody's face that you wouldn't say behind their back. And likewise, he defined gossip as saying something behind somebody's back that you wouldn't say to their face. I thought that those are very simple and great definitions. So that's one way to respond, about this concern of flattery, hypocrisy, and insincere questions. Second, in a dilemma of faithfulness, ask good questions about what is being required of you, and if that goes against obedience to God. So we have these situations. Can I submit to man's authority in this case without disobeying God? So we should seek to clarify how we would be disobeying if we don't feel like we can obey or submit to man's authority, so that we know what we are standing for if and when we have to choose not to submit to man's authority in order to obey God. So that if somebody asks, why won't you submit to this authority? Why won't you obey me? We can say, well, this is how I would be disobeying God if I were to do what you said. And then lastly, render to Caesar what is Caesar's. Pay our taxes. This is a simple one. We know that even if the government is unjust in ways, we are to render submission. We are to obey lawful authority. Romans 13 makes this clear. It says, submit to governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and whoever resists will incur judgment. And later on in that same passage, he says, pay taxes, render honor to whom honor is owed. And so we are to render this submission. So may the Lord give grace. If there's a particular area that you believe you need to respond, that we've gone over in this, may the Lord give grace to walk that out. Have a good rest of the day.